Edgar Cayce said he watched his own soul leave his body. He didn't call it a near-death experience. He called it Tuesday. For 43 years, the most documented psychic in American history would lie down, close his eyes, and speak. What came out wasn't him, at least not the him anyone knew. He'd wake up with no memory. But the stenographer sitting beside him had just recorded medical diagnoses that would later be confirmed by doctors who'd never met the patient. He described organs he'd never studied. He used terminology he couldn't define when conscious. And buried in over 14,000 transcripts, he left a single, repeated claim that science ignored for decades. The moment your soul separates from your body, something measurable happens. Researchers are now recording exactly that. If you're still watching, subscribe now. This only gets stranger. In 1910, Cayce gave a reading for a railroad worker who'd been in a coma for 3 weeks. Doctors said brain death was imminent. Cayce, unconscious in a hotel room 2 states away, described a fracture at the base of the man's skull that X-rays had missed. He said the man's consciousness was hovering, not fully present. He said the soul was tethered by what he called a silver cord, and that it was fraying but hadn't snapped. He said if they adjusted the man's 3rd vertebra, the cord would stabilize. They did. The man woke up 6 hours later. The fracture was confirmed during surgery a month afterward. Cayce had no medical training. He dropped out of school in the 9th grade, but he was consistent. Across thousands of readings, he described the same process. When you die, he said, your soul doesn't vanish. It pulls back, slow, like a tide going out. And in that space between body and departure, something lingers. He called it the etheric double, a magnetic echo of who you were, made of energy too subtle for the equipment of his time to detect. He said it was connected to the body by a cord that grew thinner as death approached, and that when it finally broke, the separation was instant. But the timing, he said, was never random. It happened at a threshold, a specific measurable moment when the body's electromagnetic field collapsed below a certain frequency. He said you could feel it if you were paying attention. In 2008, a team at the University of Southampton launched the largest study ever conducted on near-death awareness. They placed images on high shelves in hospital cardiac wards, images only visible from above from the ceiling. If patients reported floating during resuscitation and could describe the images, it would be the first controlled evidence that consciousness separates from the body. Out of 2,060 cardiac arrests, 140 patients survived. 9 reported out-of-body awareness. 2 described verifiable details they shouldn't have been able to see. 1 man recalled, with perfect accuracy, the sequence of sounds from the defibrillator, the specific wording used by the doctor, and the angle of the nurse's hands, all while his brain showed no electrical activity for over 3 minutes. But none of them saw the images on the shelves. The study was declared inconclusive. Cayce would have told them they were looking in the wrong place. He said the soul doesn't float. It pulls into a frequency just outside the visible range, like infrared sitting next to red. He said it doesn't perceive through eyes. It perceives through resonance. The images on the shelves were visual objects. The patients were describing electromagnetic information, rhythm, tone, pressure, intention. They were reading the room the way a bat reads a cave. Cayce said this perception lasts for roughly 3 days after the heart stops, which is why he insisted bodies shouldn't be embalmed or buried immediately. He said the soul was still partially anchored, still aware, and that premature interference caused confusion in the transition. Then, in 2017, Canadian doctors recorded something that shouldn't exist. A man in his 50s was removed from life support after a catastrophic stroke. His family had said goodbye. The machines were turned off. His heart stopped. Brain activity flatlined. And then for 10 minutes and 38 seconds, a single electrode in his frontal cortex registered a low-frequency delta wave pattern identical to the rhythm measured during deep sleep and dreaming. It continued long after blood stopped flowing, after oxygen was gone. The lead physician called it impossible. The wave finally stopped exactly 10 minutes after the heart did, and then nothing. Total silence. They had no explanation. Cayce had described it 70 years earlier. He said that after the heart stops, the soul initiates a review, a rapid integration of memory, emotion, and meaning. He said this process generates a wave, a final coherent pulse of organized energy that moves through the brain as the etheric body detaches. He said it felt to the dying person like watching their entire life in reverse and forward simultaneously, not as a sequence but as a pattern. He said time didn't exist in that state. He said the wave was the signature of departure. No one took him seriously until the machines got sensitive enough to see it. But the contradictions didn't stop there. In 2019, researchers at the National Institutes of Health discovered that the human body produces a brief but measurable burst of photons, actual visible light, at the moment of death. It's faint, detectable only with equipment designed to measure bioluminescence in deep-sea organisms. The light originates in the chest and abdomen and pulses outward in a pattern that mirrors the way certain jellyfish release light when they're injured. It lasts between 4 and 18 seconds. They don't know why it happens. They don't know what triggers it. But it happens in every mammal they've tested. Cayce said the soul is made of light that the body borrows and then returns. He said at death, that light is released all at once, like a camera flash in reverse, collapsing inward before it disperses. He said you could see it if you were standing close enough in a dark room. Dozens of his readings mention family members describing a glow around a loved one's body immediately after death, a luminosity that faded within seconds. Doctors at the time called it hallucination or reflected lamplight. But Cayce insisted it was real. He said it was the remnant of the cord snapping, the final energetic transaction between matter and consciousness. And then there's the wait. In 1907, a physician named Duncan McDougall placed dying tuberculosis patients on an industrial scale sensitive to a fraction of an ounce. He wanted to measure the soul. At the moment of death, he recorded a sudden drop in body weight, 21 grams in one case, 10 in another. The experiment was criticized, replicated poorly, and dismissed. But it never fully disappeared. In 2001, a researcher in Oregon repeated the experiment with better equipment and controlled for all the variables McDougall couldn't: moisture loss, air displacement, thermal radiation. He still recorded a weight loss, smaller this time, between 2 and 7 grams, but consistent, present in 4 out of 7 subjects, absent in the control group of sedated animals euthanized under identical conditions. Cayce never mentioned a number, but he said the soul had mass. Not physical mass, resonant mass. He said it existed in a state that exerted gravitational influence without occupying space the way matter does. He said the body doesn't lose the soul. It stops sustaining the frequency that keeps it anchored. And when that frequency drops, the soul doesn't evaporate. It reorganizes. It shifts into a bandwidth the body can't hold anymore. He said it's not death. It's a change in vibration. In 2020, a study published in the journal Frontiers in Aging Neuroscience found that the brains of people who reported near-death experiences showed a specific anomaly: hyperconnectivity in the temporoparietal junction, the region associated with self-location and spatial awareness. The researchers called it a neural signature of ego dissolution. People with this signature were significantly more likely to report feeling separated from their bodies, seeing themselves from an external perspective, or perceiving the boundaries of their identity as fluid or non-existent. Cayce said the temporoparietal junction was the anchor point of a silver cord. He said it's where consciousness attaches to the brain, and that in deep trance, deep meditation, or near death, that attachment loosens. He said everyone has the capacity to perceive beyond the body, but most people's cords are too tight. Fear keeps them bound. He said the dying don't fear the separation. They've already started to let go. That's why they see what others can't. But here's what no one expected. In 2018, a team of neuroscientists at the University of Michigan discovered that rats, in the 30 seconds following cardiac arrest, showed a sudden, massive spike in gamma wave activity, the highest frequency the brain produces, associated with peak awareness, sensory integration, and conscious perception. The spike was stronger and more synchronized than anything recorded during normal waking life. It lasted 13 seconds on average, then disappeared. The researchers concluded that the dying brain enters a state of heightened consciousness immediately before shutdown. Cayce said the soul becomes more awake as the body dies. He said the final moments of biological life are the most lucid a person will ever experience in physical form. He said this is why so many people report clarity, peace, or reunion with deceased loved ones in their last breaths. It's not a hallucination. It's the removal of the filter. He said the body is a reducing valve, and death opens it all the way. For a few seconds, you see everything. Then the cord breaks. Then you're free. Or you're not. Because Cayce also said not everyone leaves cleanly. He described cases, hundreds of them, where the soul remained partially tethered after death. Trauma, he said, could jam the mechanism. So could sudden violence, unfinished emotion, or a desperate refusal to accept the transition. He said these souls stayed close to the body, trying to re-enter, trying to wake it up, unable to understand why the form wouldn't respond. He said they could linger for hours, days, or in rare cases, indefinitely. He said this was the real origin of hauntings. Not spirits returning, but spirits who never left. Stuck in the space between frequencies, still attached to the place their body stopped. Modern hospice workers report the same phenomenon. There's a term for it now, terminal lucidity. It occurs in roughly 10% of dementia and Alzheimer's patients in the hours or days before death. People who haven't recognized their own children in years will suddenly sit up, speak clearly, recall memories in perfect detail, and engage in coherent conversation. Then they die. Neurologists can't explain it. The brain tissue is still damaged. The plaques are still there. There's no medical mechanism for the clarity. But it happens consistently enough that hospice staff now warn families to expect it. Cayce said it's the soul preparing to sever. He said in the final days, the soul begins to disengage from the damaged brain and access memory directly, pulling it not from neurons, but from the field it's about to return to. He said every memory you've ever had still exists, not as data in tissue, but as vibration in the fabric of your consciousness. The brain is just a retrieval tool. When it fails, you lose access. But when the soul lets go of the brain entirely, you get it all back. For a moment, and then something else happens. Cayce said the silver cord doesn't break all at once. It unravels, strand by strand, starting at the extremities, hands, feet, the outer edges of awareness. He said this is why dying people often report tingling, coldness, or numbness moving inward from their limbs. It's not circulation loss. It's the soul withdrawing from the perimeter. He said the final strands are anchored at 3 points: the base of the skull, the heart, and the solar plexus. And the order in which they release determines the quality of the transition. If the head releases first, he said, the person dies confused. Consciousness fragments before emotion and identity can integrate. If the heart releases first, the person dies peacefully. Love carries them across before thought can interfere. If the solar plexus releases first, the person dies afraid. Survival instinct pulls them back toward the body even as it fails. He said you can feel which one is happening if you're present. You can sense it in the room. In 2016, a palliative care nurse in Seattle began documenting the electrical behavior of the air around dying patients, using a device designed to measure atmospheric ions. She found that in the minutes before death, the ion density near the patient's chest and head would spike, sometimes doubling or tripling, before dropping sharply to below baseline levels within seconds of the final breath. She recorded it in 43 patients. The spike was absent in patients who died under anesthesia. It was strongest in patients who died awake and calm. She had no framework for what she was measuring. Cayce would have told her she was watching the cord snap. He said the silver cord is electromagnetic in nature, part biological, part something else. He said it's the reason you can feel someone staring at you from across a room, or sense the presence of a person you love before you see them. He said distance doesn't weaken it. Attention does. And at death, the body stops generating the attention that holds it in place. The cord doesn't break because the soul pulls away. It breaks because the body stops pulling back. He said dying isn't something that happens to you. It's something you allow. But the most unsettling detail? Cayce said the moment of departure is decided by the soul, not the body, not disease, not trauma. He said the body can be shutting down for hours, days, or weeks, but the soul won't leave until a specific internal threshold is crossed. Something resolved, something understood, something released. He said people don't die randomly. They die when they're ready. Even if they don't know, they're ready. Even if they're fighting. He said the soul knows before the mind does. And sometimes the soul waits. There are cases documented in hospitals around the world of patients who are clinically dead, flat EEG, no heartbeat, no respiration, who were kept on mechanical support while family traveled to say goodbye. And in multiple instances, the moment the final family member entered the room, the machines registered a sudden spike in brain activity, a single burst of coherent wave patterns, followed immediately by total cessation, as if the person had been waiting, watching, and only left when everyone arrived. Cayce said the soul hears everything in those final hours. He said even under anesthesia, even in a coma, even with no measurable brain function, the departing consciousness is still loosely coupled to the body, still receiving, still aware on some level of what's being said, who's present, and what's unresolved. He said the dying can feel the emotional state of everyone in the room. He said they absorb it. And if the room is filled with panic or grief that hasn't been spoken, the soul hesitates. It stays tethered, not out of obligation, out of resonance, because it's still entangled with the people it loves. He said this is why forgiveness matters at the end, not for moral reasons, for energetic ones. He said unresolved anger, guilt, or blame creates a dissonance that the soul tries to correct before leaving. And if it can't, it carries the frequency with it into the next stage. He said this is where the concept of unfinished business comes from, not metaphor, actual energetic residue. He said the cleanest deaths are the ones where everything has been said, where love is the last thing transmitted. He said in those cases, the cord dissolves almost instantly. The person slips out like water. No struggle, no lingering, just a smooth transition from one state to another. But most people don't die that way. Most people die mid-sentence, mid-thought, mid-fear. And Cayce said when that happens, the soul takes a fragment of that unfinished state with it. He said this is why some near-death experiencers return with memories that don't fit, flashes of places they've never been, people they've never met, emotions that don't belong to them. He said the space between death and full separation is porous. Thoughts bleed. Memories overlap. If you die in a hospital room where 100 others have died, your soul briefly moves through the same energetic corridor they did. And sometimes, for just a moment, you pick up an echo of someone else's departure. He said consciousness is a shared field. Death just makes that obvious. In 2014, researchers at the University of Virginia analyzed over 2,500 cases of children who reported memories of past lives. They found that children who described violent or sudden deaths in their recalled memories were significantly more likely to have birthmarks or physical anomalies in the exact locations where the fatal injury occurred in the previous life. A boy who remembered being shot in the chest had a small, circular birthmark over his sternum. A girl who remembered drowning had a cluster of pigmentation on her upper back. The study couldn't explain it. Cayce could. He said the soul carries an imprint of its final trauma. He said when death is sudden or violent, the etheric body doesn't have time to release cleanly. Part of it stays locked in the moment of injury, replaying the shock, trying to correct what can't be corrected. And when that soul reincarnates, the imprint transfers, not as memory, as pattern, written into the tissue. He said this is why phantom pain exists, why people feel injuries that aren't there. The body remembers what the soul hasn't released. But he also says something else. He said the moment the cord breaks isn't the moment you stop existing in the physical world. It's the moment you stop being confined to it. He said after separation, the soul doesn't go anywhere. It expands. It becomes simultaneously present across every place it ever loved, every person it ever connected with, every moment that mattered. He said time stops being linear. You experience your entire existence as a single, unified now. The past doesn't fade. The future doesn't approach. It's all here, all at once. He said that's what eternity actually means. And he said some souls, rare ones, learn to do this before they die. He called them adepts, people who'd practiced loosening the cord deliberately through meditation, trance, or breath work. People who'd trained their consciousness to detach and return without severing. He said these people didn't fear death because they'd already experienced it. Repeatedly, he said they knew what was on the other side because they'd been going back and forth for years. He was describing himself. Cayce's readings weren't predictions. They were reports. He said every time he entered trance, his soul partially separated from his body. He said the silver cord stretched but didn't break, and in that expanded state, he could perceive information outside the limits of his brain. He said he wasn't special. He said everyone could do it, but most people were too afraid to let go. He said fear is the only thing that keeps the soul locked in the body, and death is just the point where the body stops giving you a choice. So the question isn't whether the soul leaves. It's whether you'll recognize the moment when it does, whether you'll feel the cord thinning, whether you'll notice the room getting quieter, the edges of your vision softening, the weight of your body starting to feel optional. Cayce said you'll know. He said it doesn't feel like falling. It feels like remembering something you forgot a long time ago. He said it feels like going home. And maybe that's why the dying so often smile.